Hi, Todd VanDenburg here with VanDenburg Capital Management and another Uncommon Sense update. So the markets the last week or so have been just really ugly, primarily because of two things. And both of them have to do with fear. Fear over what the Federal Reserve might do in the coming months and the coming year regarding monetary policy. And the second item is this new Omicron variant. Um, Omicron variant. That sounds like a 70s science fiction movie, but I digress. In any case, there's some concerns about what does this mean? Is this going to cause us to have additional lockdowns, additional restrictions, which could result in economic slowdowns like we saw in early 2020? And so that's really what I want to talk about today. Actually, both topics. So I'll cover the Federal Reserve first. So the Federal Reserve, as many of you know, has been printing money and inserting it into the economy through the banks in the form of what they used to call quantitative easing. So basically, the Federal Reserve takes money that they print out of nothing, and then they buy bonds from the banks, and so the bonds are flush with cash, and the Federal Reserve is holding this debt obligation. So what that means is that at least the thought is that by inserting this money into the banks will then insert it into the economy, and that will accelerate economic growth. Well, as you also have probably noticed, inflation has been not amazing here the last quarter or two, and that is primarily because the economy is just awash in cash, but there are constraints on goods and services. So whenever that happens, you have a lot of dollars chasing a limited supply of goods and services. The prices just go up. So the Federal Reserve's comments today basically indicated that they're going to slow that process down, and the markets are not reacting well to it. Anytime the Federal Reserve doesn't pump free money into the economy, the markets tend to have what they call a taper tantrum. Whoever comes up with these sayings, I got to give them credit, because I wouldn't have been creative enough to come up with taper tantrum. Again, I digress. So I don't think that the taper, or this reduction in Federal Reserve printing money, is going to have really any real economic impact to our economy in the way of a slowdown, or even having to do something about the inflation rate, because I'm going to show you a couple of charts here, show you them separate, and then I'm going to show you them merged. So the first chart shows all the money that the Federal Reserve has been pumping into the banks, pretty much since the last financial crisis back in 08-09. And as you can see, the Federal Reserve has just been printing money hand over fist. They never had done this before, and so it's been a decade-long experiment. And as you can see, the Federal Reserve has quite a lot of money sitting out in banks in the form of obligations to repay a bond. Well, now I'm going to show you the next chart. It's like, what have the banks done with that money? The assumption, and what the media seems to report, is that the banks, of course, are taking this money and loaning it to small businesses and using it to generate economic activity. Well, I'm going to show you another chart here that sort of flies contrary to that. And this chart shows the amount of money held by the banks at the Federal Reserve. So I'm going to say that again, because this never happened in any measurable way prior to the financial crisis. Is the Federal Reserve prints money out of nowhere and gives it to the banks, and then the banks deposit it back at the Federal Reserve. And one of the reasons that they do this is the Federal Reserve pays interest on that money. So the banks are basically getting free interest to hold money that they didn't necessarily want or need. So as the Federal Reserve reduces or even starts calling some of this money back, it's not going to come out of the economy. It's going to come out of these excess reserves that the banks are just holding at the Federal Reserve. So there's trillions and trillions of dollars that the banks have been holding at the Federal Reserve. So if the Fed stops giving them more money, what's going to happen is that the amount of money held at the Federal Reserve may flatten or start to go down, but it would have to go down by several trillion dollars to get back down to where it was pre the financial crisis of 08 and 09. So they could pull back, again, trillions of dollars, and not a penny has to come out of the economy because it's all just coming out of one pants. It basically came out of one pocket at the Federal Reserve, and then the banks deposit it into the other pocket at the Federal Reserve. So we're not at all concerned. The markets clearly are concerned about this, but we think it's just fear, and it's not based upon the actual reality on the ground. So we're not running from the markets because this is just volatility based upon fear. The second concern is the Omicron variant. And, I totally get it, right? There's another variant. And when the Delta variant hit, there was a lot of, again, fear, rightfully so, because it looked like it was more transmissible and there were more people going into the hospital. And so that was like, something that at least you could wrap your head around. Well, the Omicron variant, as soon as it was announced that there's this new variant and the World Health Organization gave it a name, the markets on Friday just tanked, and they're not having a good day today either. And again, we think this fear is overblown, at least based upon what we know. And here's what we know is the scientist who initially uncovered this has said, yes, it's a new variant. It's got lots of mutations. I think the last count was 30 different mutations, which they say is unprecedented. But why is there always an assumption that these mutations are always going to be bad or worse? Nobody ever seems to want to say, well, maybe before we assume that they're going to be worse, maybe we should see. And this doctor or scientist who had initially discovered this variant, his observation is that the symptoms are mild, and it appears to be very contagious, it can spread very easily, but it doesn't appear to have the same level of severity as the initial COVID or the Delta variant. Now, again, we need more data, and we're certainly going to get it, but all the media seems to want to report is that it's a new variant, it's got a name, and hey, we can get more clicks and more views if we scare the bejeebers out of people, and that seems to be what's happening, because you could imagine, right? If people were dying left and right from the Omicron variant, that would be the headline. But we're not seeing those headlines. What we're seeing, and if you read all these headlines, there's fear that it's more transmissible, which it appears to be. There's fear that it could be more deadly, which we don't have evidence of. So I don't know. I mean, instead of having fear of the worst possible scenario at every possible turn, maybe the media could take a moment, take a step back and go, well, we don't have enough data to know exactly which way this is going to go, but the data that we do have seems to indicate that it's mild. It was all factual statements. So the markets are volatile. We get why they're volatile because when people are fearful, markets get volatile, and when the institutional investors get a sense that people are fearful, they tend to do things to take advantage of fearful people, and that causes the markets to go down even more. So again, we're not sellers into this market. We think once we get more data, then hey, maybe we're a seller, but the data would have to change from the data that's currently available in order for us to make that kind of a determination. What I also know is that roughly half of the states in the United States have made it very clear that regardless of whatever variants of COVID-19 pop up, they're not going back to the broad lockdowns and restrictions that we saw in early 2020. And there's people can argue about whether that's good, bad, right, or wrong. That's not my place. But since they've made it clear that, places like Florida and Texas are not, and many others, but, those are the big ones that everybody talks about. So those places are not likely to lock down because they've said they're not going to. They're going to approach it in a different way. And we have enough data to know that the way they've approached it over the last year and 3/4 has not resulted in them having significantly or dramatically or statistically significant increases in spread or fatality or hospital occupancy. So I guess they're saying that there's more than one way to react to these variants. And so if we know that roughly half of the states are not going to lock down, then we know that the economic activity and slowdown that we saw in early 2020, we're not going to have a repeat of that because there won't be enough willing participants as there were when we first saw COVID and didn't know. So everybody shut down early on when COVID first hit. And now that we have enough data to know, at least some states believe that we know, that there's other ways to accomplish this without also crippling people financially, I think we're unlikely to see similar economic downturns like we saw in 2020. Again, more reason why we're not selling into this fear is because even if this happens to have a fatality rate closer to Delta or the original coronavirus, half the states in the United States are still not going to shut down. They're going to approach this a different way. So while the markets are volatile, we don't like it. We've seen like over the last month, it's just, it's not looked awesome. I'm going to show you one more chart from like year to date to show you that there have been several times, like 5 or 6 times this year where we've had like really incredible pullbacks. And the doom and gloomers were like, okay, this is the beginning of the end. And every time, the sort of reality was not what the doom and gloomers predicted. And we've continued to sort of pull our way back. And that's sort of based upon the data that we have and that is available today. That's sort of what we see happening over the balance of the year. So a lot of stuff I went over. Hope it wasn't too much. If anybody has any questions about this or any other financial matter, please, post a comment to this video, send me an email, give me a call. I'm happy to answer any question. But that was your update. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give us a like, give us a share, and I'll be back again soon with another Uncommon Sense update. Thanks for watching.
If you'd like to be the first to hear of more Uncommon Sense updates like these, please click the subscribe button below. We'd really appreciate it. Thanks again.